Hello, everyone. We're just going to wait a minute to see how many people join us, and then we'll get started with this session. Okay, well, I think we might as well get started. We're a couple of minutes past the scheduled start time, and I'm sure people will be able to pick up as we go along. So it's good morning for me, and I hope it's a good day wherever you are in the world. My name is Eoghan Griffin, and I'm the Executive Officer at SCAR. And I'll share my screen now with a little bit of information about this session. Apologies. Oh, I'm giving away all of my stuff. So, I work with the Vice President for Capacity Building, Dr. Ravichandran, and the Capacity Building Education and Training Committee, and other SCAR groups to deliver our capacity building activities. So, as an overview of the session we'll have this morning, for me, wherever you are in the world at your time, we will hear about the we'll hear from Dr. Ravichandran, and then discuss the fellowships from both myself from the practical point of view, and Dr. Morgan Sieg who's been a previous SCAR fellow, but also a leading contributor to our work on equality, diversity and inclusion over the recent years. We'll also hear about the work of the SCAR EDI Action Group from its Chief Officer, Dr. Adriana Golisano, about the importance of partnerships from Dr. Renuka Bade, the Executive Secretary of the European Polar Board, and one of our partner organizations, Polar Educators International, have also provided an introduction to their work, in particular the Polar Resource Book Project, and they'll be represented by their Vice President, Sophie Weeks, supportive of this session. Dr. Inga Beck is currently consulting with the Secretariat, and she will introduce an educational initiative she's working on, making use of SCAR's social media channels. So there will be an opportunity for some questions after the fellowship and visiting scholars presentations, around 5 minutes each, but also a fuller question and answer session at the end of the session to cover all of the topics that we've introduced and talked about. So as I say, I work with Dr. Ravichandran. Unfortunately, he has been unable to be here in person, given his responsibilities at the Ministry for Earth Sciences. But he has sent a pre-recorded message for us, which we can hear now.
Very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I am Ravichandran, Secretary, Ministry of Earth Sciences, Government of India, and Vice President of SCAR, looking after capacity building, education, and training since 2018. Welcome to the capacity building workshop as part of the Open Science Conference. Over the last number of years, there has been a lot of work done by the Capacity Building, Education, and Training Committee to improve the capacity building schemes that SCAR operates, as well as expanding the scope and impact through working with partners. I thank the members of the CBET committee for their immense contributions. The CBET committee has worked to advance SCAR activities in building capacity where possible, and in particular in addressing some of the issues arising from the impact of COVID-19 pandemic through 2020. Since 2018, we have introduced the Visiting Scholar Scheme with more resources and a simpler application process for the scholars compared to the previous Visiting Professor Scheme. An important aspect was emphasizing that the scheme was open and relevant to mid-career researchers. This has resulted in a significant improvement not just in terms of overall applications, but also in terms of gender balance across those applications. For 2022, we have introduced a new nomination process for the SCAR medals, which again improved both the overall number and gender balance of the nominations received. We have continued to work with the partners to expand the impact of SCAR capacity building activities, including with the Polar Educators International to advance Polar Resource Book Project, as well as Convenor, who kindly funded 2 fellowships for SCAR applicants in 2021. The fellowship scheme will benefit in 2022 and beyond from new support from the Prince Albert II of Monaco Foundation, who will provide an extra SCAR fellowship each year for at least the next 4 years as part of the Polar Initiative project. In 2020, we convened a scoping group on equality, diversity, and inclusivity, which looked at what SCAR could do about these issues. The scoping group drew up a series of potential areas to work on and in particular recommended the establishment of an action group dedicated to these issues. The action group was approved by SCAR delegates in 2021 and called for volunteers later in the year. Over 150 volunteers came forward, and from them a leadership team has been working to establish a small group working on each of their identified priorities. We look forward to working with the EDA action group in the coming years to have a consistent approach across all our capacity building activities. All these topics along with question and answer will be covered in this workshop, and I once again welcome you all for the CBET workshop. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to say that it's been a pleasure to work with Ravi over the last few years, and thank him for sending us that message. I'd like to start the session, if you like, the topics we cover with the SCAR fellowships. So I'll share my screen and go through a description of the program and hopefully point to some useful areas that you can find information about it. We'll then have testimony from a past fellow, and then there'll be a 5-minute session at the end for questions. So that one will be, as I described earlier, just a short session to answer specific questions on the fellowships, and then we'll move on with the rest of the program. So as I said, I'd like to start today by introducing the opportunities available from SCAR for early career researchers through our fellowship scheme. It's an annual scheme and it's currently open. The scheme aims to provide early career researchers with an opportunity to make a short visit of several weeks or months from their home institutes to a facility in another country. And the idea is to foster international capacity and cooperation through the experience of the fellows. We do have some eligibility criteria to apply to the fellowship scheme. So you must be a current PhD student or within 5 years of having received your PhD. These 5 years cover full-time professional research. So if you have had time off for maternity or paternity leave or other reasons, then you can contact us to let us know when you apply. Importantly, you can apply from any country, so it doesn't have to be a SCAR member country, but your host institute must be in a SCAR member country, which is also different from your home country and your current workplace, if they are 2 different countries. So the proposal must contribute to the objectives of at least one of our science groups. And the SCAR website is full of information about those, broken down by discipline, and we cover the full range of research from the humanities to cosmology and pretty much everything in between. As I said, the scheme is open at present. The closing date is the 31st of August. So we hope that people will be inspired and maybe make some connections through the Open Science Conference that will enable them to follow up with applications that can come in before the end of the month. And then how do you find out about the scheme and how to apply? Well, the SCORE website is the first place to go to. It provides an overview of the scheme, including the nature of the awards, reiterates the eligibility criteria. You can access information about fellows past and present. And so importantly, there's how to apply for the scheme, some mentoring materials available for applicants, and also we cover some frequently asked questions. So all of that's available from the fellowship section on the SCORE website. And the application form is an online form that's available through the website as well. So one very useful document to access and download on this page is the application pack. And that pulls together lots of the most important guidance and information about the scheme. And it should hopefully answer many of your questions about the scheme. So also, if you want to make direct contact with us and you have queries about the information that's available on the website, just send an email to info@score.org. We're very happy to answer any queries. Don't be shy. That's what we're there for. Just send us anything that you want. Then we hope to make 4 to 5 awards from the funds we have available this year. And the budget is up to $15,000 US. So that doesn't mean you need to scope a proposal to absolutely hit $15,000 on the nail. We do expect a detailed budget when you make a proposal. And so we'll have a look at that to see how practical that is, etc. But that's the limit for an application, $15,000. Now, as I said, we do have some mentoring materials on the website. Some of these are in the form of webinars that we produced in collaboration with the Association of Polar Early Career Scientists, or APEX, and also the Council of Managers of National Antarctic Programs, or COMNAP, and we'll talk about them a little bit later as well. This includes some in different languages, which help with applications to the schemes. And these are also available to APEX through its website. We'd like to expand this in future and work with APEX and others to have as many languages covered by this support for our applicants as possible. So do please get in touch if you think you could help with that. For 2022, we're delighted to have extra support available from the Prince Albert II of Monaco Foundation through the Polar Initiative Project, which also involves our sister organization in the Arctic, the International Arctic Science Committee, or IASC. This support will be in place for at least the next 4 years, and we're very grateful to receive it. So this means that we will have this extra fellowship available for that period, and we hope, as long as the Polar Initiative continues, that this support will continue as well. This follows a period where we used the funds from a biodiversity prize also from the Prince Albert Foundation that we received in 2013. That was fed directly into the fellowships and supported fellowships over 5 years up till 2020. So it's great that we've actually renewed this relationship with the Prince Albert Foundation and have this support going forward. We also just announced that one of the fellowships in 2020 will be reserved for an applicant from Ukraine. And this clearly reflects the situation and difficulties that our colleagues in Ukraine are facing. Yeah, we hope that this will in some way help to support our colleagues in that country. So again, some of the information that's available from the website is technical, if you like, in the sense that it gives you the details of what's required when you make your proposal, and the structure of any application includes things like using keywords, and they're really important because that helps us match applications to particularly qualified reviewers, and that's an important part of the process to be able to do that for every application. and you need to have already prepared the agreements between your home and host institutes, and we have all of the templates for those available on the website as well. So yeah, the message is basically from the technical side, have a look at the website, find out all of the information from there, and then if you have any questions, get in direct contact with us as soon as possible so that we can get you the information you need. The information also covers how we go about evaluating. So it's important for you to understand that when you're putting in an application to the fellowship scheme, what way it's going to be evaluated, so that hopefully you will structure your application to make sure that you address all of these areas that are actually going to be evaluated by our reviewers. And clearly the research quality and relevance to SCAR are key elements, but the capacity building potential and deliverability of the proposal are also important. And all of our applicants will receive feedback on their proposals from the reviewing process. And we hope this is useful for either further applications to our fellowship scheme or in general to other applications that the fellows may be making. Now, clearly, over recent years, we've had major problems in terms of the effective delivery of the fellowship scheme while the COVID pandemic has been going on. While we hope that in the coming months the conditions will continue to improve and allow more, if not all, of these restrictions to be eased, we realise that we're going to have to be flexible in dealing with the practical limitations for our fellows. So SCAR is committed to working with their fellows to ensure that we can be as flexible as necessary to make the schemes a success. We're already doing this with the SCAR fellows from 2020 and beyond, and we expect that it'll be necessary. And so we do things like extending the time limit for completing a fellowship, which at present is 1 year from the date of the award, but we can be flexible on that. But also completion of the proposal objectives through virtual meetings can also be considered, and we'll have proactive conversations with all of our awardees about the practicalities once we've announced the results. So don't feel as if you need to be restricted by things that are currently in place. We will try to work with you as flexibly as possible to make the proposal that you've put together be deliverable, if you like. Sorry, I should also talk a little bit about, we're not alone in offering opportunities for early career researchers in the Antarctic community. ComNAP, that I mentioned earlier, offer a single fellowship annually and administer another on behalf of IATO, who represent the tourist operators. And the details of eligibility differ from those of the SCAR scheme, and they're different between the ComNAP version and the IATO version. So you need to check their website for the specific details. They have a list of priority projects and topics for their fellowship. And so it's important that you match whatever application you're making in those instances to their criteria. Yes, we've worked very closely with ComNAP over at least the last decades in terms of trying to both promote each other's schemes, explain them, and work together proactively when possible. And as Ravi mentioned, in 2021, we're very fortunate to receive support from ComNAP to be able to support 2 extra fellowships from SCAR applicants. And so that brought the number of applicants to our scheme that received awards to 7, and then 5 directly from SCAR. So that was great. CAMLAR also run their own scheme. It's a scholarship scheme. It's quite different in its in the way that it's set up from the SCAR and ComNAP ones. So you need to really look through the details of their scheme on their website as well. All of these links are available from our website as well. So you can link through and find all of this information by visiting the SCAR website. Okay. So I should also say that as long as you're signed up to our social media, in Facebook, Twitter, etc., and receive our newsletters, then you should be informed about the timings, announcements, etc., for this fellowship scheme all of the way through the year. We'll also announce whenever we have webinars available coming up, that sort of thing. So keep an eye out for SCAR news in relation to this and how it might be applicable to you. But I am delighted to say that now we have some personal testimony from Dr. Morgan Sieg, who's a recent SCAR Fellow, and will hopefully give you a better flavour of the potential of the scheme for your career. So over to you, Morgan. I'll just stop.
Thanks very much, Eoghan. Thanks, Eoghan, and hello, everybody. Good morning, afternoon, evening. I'm going to speak very briefly about my fellowship, less about the content and more about its impacts on me, and especially how it evolved. I think that the way that my fellowship took shape really illustrates the flexibility and value of SCAR's approach to the fellowship in the current situation. So I'm a SCAR Fellow. I finished my PhD early this year at the University of Cambridge. Another aspect about me that's relevant to this fellowship is I'm also the parent of a toddler who was born during the pandemic. And the flexibility of the fellowship has been important, not only in navigating the pandemic, but in navigating life changes that many applicants may not be able to foresee as they're conceptualizing their project. Briefly, I'll just mention some of the impacts of the fellowship sort of upfront before getting into the way that it evolved. I learned an enormous amount as a fellow hosted at the University of Tasmania. My primary host was Dr. Hannah Nielsen, and my co-host was Dr. Meredith Nash. We later brought on board Renuka Bade, who's here on the panel as a collaborator for the output of the project. And I just learned an incredible amount from my hosts, as well as from the experience of leading a virtual collaboration, which is something that I think many early career researchers don't necessarily have the opportunity to do during the course of their graduate work, especially. So that's been really unique. It's resulted in ongoing collaborations with my hosts and collaborators. And it was also really valuable to get to know a new academic context, a new institutional culture that I wouldn't have been able to immerse in quite the same way in if I had stayed at my home university throughout. So briefly, I wanted to apply for the SCAR Fellowship to extend my research expertise in part. I wanted to move away from the geographic case study that I had been working on as a PhD student. I was studying culture, policy, and history in Antarctic research with a focus on how women came to be involved in Antarctic science, focused on the US, and I wanted a more global view of that. I also wanted to enhance my skills in methodology that was less historical in focus and more contemporary. And I wanted to learn from the specific hosts who I applied to work with, who are leading experts in my field. So I applied to spend 2 months in Hobart at the University of Tasmania, Australia, hosted by Hannah Nielsen and Meredith Nash. And we were planning to do a survey-based methodology where we would send out questionnaires to folks to try to get an idea of the gendered experiences and barriers that people encountered during Antarctic fieldwork. And that plan had to be amended pretty quickly. And again, here, I'm very grateful to SCAR for their flexibility and understanding, and also willingness to evolve their own guidelines, I guess, around the project as time went on, because I was in the first cohort of people affected by the pandemic as a SCAR Fellow. So I became pregnant the first time that I applied and withdrew my application because I wasn't going to be able to travel to Tasmania. But then the second time that I applied, when I was awarded the fellowship, the pandemic hit. And at that point, SCAR suggested they might be willing to consider virtual proposals. And that has been a really fantastic opportunity for me. And so potential applicants might be wondering what that kind of proposal looks like. Eoghan can definitely answer more questions about what's permissible, what's normal. But what I did was I applied to spend 2 months virtually working with my hosts. We would meet on a weekly basis through Zoom and then have ad hoc meetings and exchange emails throughout the weeks. I would participate in any kind of seminars through the department and institute that I could. And as far as the budget, because I know that's a question people often have, this was, of course, the very among the very first of the virtual applications. But what I did personally was applied for the amount of funding that I would have required in order to work in Tasmania, but without the travel. So it became a contribution to my accommodation, living costs, and other kinds of costs associated with the project, just without the travel. But that may not be right for everybody. The world changed, though, and has continued to change pretty substantially. And so I want to highlight that we also changed the methodology of my project. There was pretty widespread survey fatigue by the time I was ready to start my project. So we moved away from a survey-based methodology. Fieldwork was very uncertain. So surveying people about fieldwork was no longer, we thought, the most appropriate way to go about answering the questions that we had. And importantly, the timeline also shifted, in part because my PhD completion was delayed by the combination of new parenthood and pandemic. SCAR was extremely understanding about that. And as were my hosts, importantly, in being really patient and flexible to start the fellowship at a time that worked for all of us, because hosts, of course, are also going through these world changes. But something I would recommend now in retrospect is that rather than doing the 2-month full-time fellowship that I had initially applied for based on the visit to Tasmania that didn't end up happening, we decided to spread out the fellowship so that instead of being 2 months full-time, it took place part-time over a period of several months. And that actually enabled me to have more contact hours with my hosts without us having Zoom fatigue and having to be online all the time. It helped to compensate a bit for the loss of, informal conversations over coffee and lunch that might have happened if I was there. And it also allowed me to participate in more of their departmental and institutional events locally, which was really important to me as well. Because in a span of 2 months, there's only so many seminars and meetings that happen, but over a period of more months, I was able to get to know people a bit better beyond my hosts. So that was really valuable, and I would encourage people to think about that. And so then just to reiterate that the impacts on me personally and professionally have been significant, and I'm really grateful for the fellowship. I did gain all the skills that I was hoping to gain. And then in addition, the experience of leading a virtual collaboration has been more beneficial already than could have been predicted at the outset, because virtual work is now such an integral part of how we operate in Antarctic research and elsewhere. So if anybody's thinking virtual fellowship, I strongly encourage you to talk to potential hosts about how that might look, consider what kinds of timing might work best for that, what kinds of timelines. I'm very happy to answer any questions. And also to note that the virtual option did benefit me, not only because I wasn't able legally to travel to Tasmania to start the fellowship, but also as a new parent, it enabled an enormous degree of flexibility for my family circumstances. So thank you to SCAR for those, I guess you might consider them in some ways, EDI impacts of the flexibility around the fellowship. So just to conclude then, thank you so much to SCAR for supporting this. It's been a wonderful experience and also very useful to my career progression. Thank you also to my hosts and to my collaborators for making this such an enriching experience.
That's great. Thank you so much, Morgan, for that. I think that's going to be incredibly useful for all of the people who are considering applications. As I indicated, we will take a few questions now. I'll try and keep it down to 5 minutes so that we can move on with the rest of the session. We have a few in the Q&A already. So I'll just go through these and answer them as I can. If not, I will pass them off to panelists and see how they get on with them. So the first one is that it's from Alice Oates. Given ECRs may not have extensive networks already, especially after 2 years of no or very little in-person interaction within the community, how would you advise a potential applicant to go about finding a host institute researcher if they don't already have those connections in place? I would say from the SCAR perspective, one of the things you can do is look for the most relevant groups available through our website. All of our groups are expected to support early career researchers. We should be responsive in terms of if they're not able to host themselves, then they should be able to suggest maybe potentially useful institutions to make applications to. and yeah, they should generally be supportive in that way. You can, of course, directly contact info at SCAR as well, just for general advice on that. We may know, you know, people that way. Apex, of course, is a really good resource as well. You could contact either your national Apex committee or Apex centrally to ask if they'd have any suggestions. Yeah, I mean, those are two that come off the top of my head, but if any of the panelists want to jump in there with other suggestions, then feel free.
I would just reiterate what Eoghan said, that I've found the SCAR groups to be extremely supportive throughout, that emailing somebody from the group and mentioning that I'm involved in SCAR, or at the, you know, in past years was interested in becoming involved. Everybody's been very supportive, and I've had people from different SCAR groups recommend to me to reach out to people within the group about things like next step in careers, and also that Apex, I haven't been involved in a little bit over a year, but they did historically have a mentorship database where people from the SCAR community had agreed to serve as mentors based on various aspects of their work. So encourage you to reach out to Apex or have a look at that database and see if somebody on it works in your field and either would be willing to serve as a host or might know the right people.
That's great. Thank you, Morgan. Okay, we can move to the second question then, is is it expected that living costs will be included in the proposed budget, i.e. if the applicant cannot otherwise afford accommodation and bills for the duration of the fellowship? Yes, as Morgan described in the instance of her virtual fellowship, yeah, the equivalent that we would be providing for people's costs when they make the travel, it's possible to do that. So, you know, we're not just paying for the flights when we're envisaging what happens in a fellowship. It is full support of the fellow while they're away in the other country. Clearly, that is still available if you're doing a virtual fellowship. The only, you know, limit on that would be, you know, obviously you can't be concurrently employed by your home institute at the same time. We don't want to double you know, contribute. So as long as you make all of that clear in the application, then that's absolutely fine. Next we have, can the visit be extended up to 5 to 6 months in time if there's additional support? Yes, it certainly can be. And if you like, as long as the element of capacity building is clear, that we're doing things that basically aren't going to happen otherwise, that still needs to be, you know, a core part of the proposal. So you just need to make clear how critical the element of support through the fellowship is going to be to the delivery of whatever is happening in the course of the fellowship. How many publications will be required to get selected? Absolutely no limit on that. I mean, the acid test here is how much capacity building takes place. So, and of course, we're looking at people who are either starting a PhD, in the middle of a PhD, 5 years after their PhD. It's all relative to your career stage. So there's no limit in terms of publications. We don't ask for a full publication list as part of the proposal. Of course, it can be referenced as you know, in support of what's being proposed, but there's no criteria or no limits that you need to meet to make a proposal based on that. Are there any fellowship schemes for mid-career researchers working on polar studies but don't have an affiliation at present? Not having an affiliation is fine. If you don't have a home institute, we have actually accepted applications from people without home institutes who would basically be in between career settings, if you like. That's absolutely fine. We just need to have a little bit of clarity as to you know, costs incurred in the home country, things like that. But it's not something that stops you from making an application. Do you have a home institution? If you're an ECO between jobs, oh yeah, I think this one is covered by the previous one. You can definitely still, so if you're an ECO between jobs, you can still apply. Yes, absolutely. how EDI can be incorporated in the SCAR fellowships. I think we have a presentation coming up on that a little bit later, so stay tuned. Well, that's worked out very nicely in the sense that we've come to the end of the questions and we're at the end of the 5 minutes. So I will get on with the next section here, but do remember that if you have other questions relating to fellowships, you can still, we'll try and get to answer them at the end of the session in the Q&A or overall for the session at that point. So feel free to keep thinking about questions that might be relevant. But for now, I'll move on to an introduction to the SCAR Visiting Scholar Scheme, which works in parallel, if you like, with the fellowships. It's intended to target mid to later career researchers. So it's a complement, if you like, in a real sense. So I will just share my screen again. Move on to that. So it's also based around short-term visits to another SCAR member country. In this case, usually a week or two. And in recent years, we revised the guidance, obviously, an application procedure to simplify the process and expand the scope of what's possible by career stage and the nature of the project. So we'll describe those changes as we go through this. So these changes were put in place basically to emphasize the core purpose of the scheme in building capacities in countries with smaller or less developed Antarctic research programs, and also to emphasize the potential for this capacity building to be in either direction. So including the visits from developing programs to gain experience, which will be of use once the scholar returns to their home institute, or that experience being delivered by somebody traveling from a better, more developed program to a less developed program. So, which may be viewed as the traditional visiting scholar model, but we'd like to emphasize that actually it can happen in either direction. Eligibility begins 5 years after completing your PhD. So basically at the crossover limit for the fellowships. Once you're ineligible for a fellowship, you're eligible for a visiting scholarship. So there's no barrier to relatively young researchers applying to the scheme. And as with the fellowships, the host country must be a SCAR member and different from the applicant's home and current country. The simplification of the application process, and this was when we transitioned from the visiting professorship scheme we previously ran to, in 2018, this visiting scholar scheme. It means the main proposal is limited to 1 page and the CV, which has had great benefits in terms of diversity of applications in recent years. As with the fellowships, all of the details, including the online application form, are available from the SCAR website. And we have the full guidance documentation available from the all of the documentation includes the evaluation, etc. What you need to include, and so it should be all of the information you require to make an application. However, as ever, info@SCAR is there if you have any queries, and we will be very happy to receive your interest and your queries at that email address. And apologies for that. The limit in terms of the budget for a visiting scholar application is $5,000. So in this instance, you just need to be confident that that is practically a sufficient budget to be able to deliver the proposal that you put in. So at that point, I will stop this presentation and again open up to the Q&A, and this time if we can be specifically answering anything on the visiting scholar scheme, then I'll be very happy to do so. I see there's a question that might actually be relevant to fellowships and to visiting scholars, which is, does the host lab or the PI need to be active in Antarctic research? Actually, no. we're flexible in this as well. Of course, it's down to the proposal to make the case that the proposal overall is actually relevant to Antarctic research. But when we look at the complementarity between research in the Arctic and the Antarctic, for instance, it could well be that you're hosted by an Arctic institution and you're learning skills that are relevant and can be passed to the Antarctic context. So that's perfectly permissible. And of course, we heard through the teleconnection session yesterday how important all of these linkages are to other areas globally as well. I mean, these things are, we don't have any limitation from that perspective. The only the requirement basically is though that the proposals, both fellowship and visiting scholars, do need to explain the relevance to Antarctic research, because that needs to be core to the proposal in both cases. Okay. So if we don't have any other questions right now, then I'd now like to ask Adriana Gulasano to talk about the SCAR Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Action Group. And Adriana is the Chief Officer of that group, but also the Deputy Chief Officer of the Physical Sciences disciplinary group within SCAR. So without any further ado, I will pass over to Adriana.
Thank you. Well, I'll be talking about our action group, the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, EDI group. As Eoghan have pointed out, I'm the Chief Officer. The Zia Madani is the Deputy Chief Officer, and Pilvi Mustichiello is the Secretary. I structure this talk about our work streams, the actions we have already have taken, and our future actions. So as we are working on our EDI statement, I mean, what in the context of SCAR EDI means. We are also obviously working on this annual Open Science Conference, EDI session planning and delivery. You can see all the people involved that is responsible for these streams of actions. Because I do not want you to think that this is just a little 3 persons endeavor, but it's all this leadership group is responsible for this, and of course is receiving assistance from the community that was interested in our EDI group. So these are the ones that are responsible, but there's a lot of people working on this. Of course, we also have planning different outreach events. We are having a review of different national codes of conduct to explore whether SCAR would create some community guidelines and recommendations to support the evolving science community. We have done some recommendations on reviewing the current structures of recognition. And of course, there was a work very, very nice done by Morgan Sieg, presenting the existing data reviews and dissemination. After the Open Science Conference, we will start to work on a review of writing paper review of the SCAR EDI data that was reviewed based on the data prepared by Morgan. And of course, there's in progress these SCAR community demographic surveys for this SCAR Open Science Conference. We are also trying to tackle the linguistic diversity to make all our material more accessible for everybody. And we have representatives from different groups among our leadership group, from Apex, for instance, and Apex is also in contact with other polar institutions. We have also a representative from the Open Science Organizing Committee. We have links also with the COMNAT because we are trying to tackle some, increase the collaboration with them in DDI issues, and with the SUS, that is the Southern Ocean Observatory system, because they have also an EDI group. So what we have done, we start reviewing and making recommendations on SCAR meta renomination and evaluation processes. We assemble a calendar of relevant dates to outreach purposes. We have a social media campaign regarding International Day of Women and Girls in Science to promote the full and equal access of and participation of females in science. In particular, we promoted Antarctic research among women. And we performed this campaign in the 4 languages of the treaty system to get more audience and to break language barriers. I think this is very important. And that was quite an endeavor to try to translate everything to the 4 languages. And we start gathering information on different Antarctic program protocols and codes of conduct. That is underway. This is a work in progress. As Eoghan mentioned, regarding the medal nominations, there's a simple 2-step procedure now in place with 2 sets of different referees, and people of all backgrounds and diversities are encouraged to apply. And this line of action will continue taking into account the preliminary findings that we have reviewed and the new data that will arise from these new medals this year. This is an example of the calendar I was talking about. You can see the International Day of Women and Girls in Science and other relevant for EDI and for our community that was assembled. This is just to illustrate the campaign. I didn't put the text in the 4 languages, but this is with the pictures of people in the field that I think that was important to show women doing field work in Antarctica. And as I mentioned, we start gathering information on different Antarctic program protocols and codes of conduct. And we are gathering material from Apex, from SUS, and peer-reviewed journals, and different sources. And we are in contact with COMNAP to know their perspective on EDI issues, to also work with them. And as a reference, I can show you this publication of 2021 by Meredith Nash. For example, this is how national science program responses to field work sexual harassment. And in this table, you can see how different Antarctic programs from different countries tackle this issue. So that's some of the information we're gathering to try to make recommendations to the SCAR groups. So our main future plans. As outcome of the business meetings and Open Science Conference, we intend to prepare a statement from our action group. We will continue with the review of the national program protocols to identify common points to start working on recommendations. And we intend to analyze the data already gathered to present the conclusions in a white paper to help the community to assess these EDI concerns. So I wish we could have this button, really no, treat everyone with respect and everything would be solved. But till now, we are working on this. Thank you. I hope I'm on time, right? I didn't pass the time. I'm okay. Thank you.
Yep, that's great. Thank you very much, Adriana. And yeah, of course, we hope to work very closely with the EDI Action Group as we go through the annual iterations of the program, but to have a dedicated group looking specifically at EDI issues that can feed in consistently across all of our programs, of course, is really important. So that's something we very much look forward to in the coming years. Thank you for that. And I'd now like to introduce Dr. Renuka Bade, the Executive Secretary of the European Polar Board, whose experience in capacity building goes way beyond mine, covers SCAR and just about every Antarctic relevant organization you could care to mention, and Renuka is very kindly representing SCAR on the International Science Council's Standing Committee on Gender Equality in Science at present. So I'd like to hand over now to Renuka, who's going to talk about working with partners.
Thank you very much, Eoghan, for that kind introduction. My name is Renuka Bade, and I'm here wearing a couple of hats today. I'm currently serving as the Executive Secretary of the European Polar Board, and I'm also co-founder of an organization called Women in Polar Science. And both the EPB and Women in Polar Science work quite actively with SCAR. So I think I can happily wear both my hats for this talk today. SCAR's capacity building efforts are focused in two ways. One, they are internally focused to help develop capacity within SCAR members, and other efforts within SCAR are externally focused that support different organizations for things like capacity development, for ensuring that the best practice and knowledge that SCAR has developed in its long and storied history so far is shared between all the partners. So I think Eoghan has talked quite a bit about some of the internal focused capacity development measures like the fellowships and the visiting professorships. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about the external focused partnerships, which I have either directly or indirectly been a part of in the last few years. So the way SCAR works with partners is really they lead the way. They show they're generally the first in a lot of things where they set the path that other organizations can easily follow. They also have an aspect of knowledge transfer and best practice sharing, as I was saying, and in general, they support capacity building in the different partners that they work with. So one of the fantastic examples of leading the way was SCAR's work with Apex. SCAR has been working with Apex right since Apex's inception in 2008. And the latest MOU that SCAR has with Apex dates back to 2019. There are many activities that have been planned and executed throughout the years. There's webinars, there's training, there's mentoring that Morgan and Adriana briefly mentioned in their talks. There are also quite a few Apex representatives that work on the different SCAR committees, on the action and expert groups that SCAR has, and also the science and science research programs as well. Eoghan talked in detail about the fellowships that are targeted specifically to early career researchers, which is Apex's their main stakeholder, I guess. Within knowledge transfer and best practice sharing, like I said, SCAR is one of the oldest international organizations within the polar world, definitely. It recently celebrated its 60th anniversary. So there's lots of collective expertise and experience there that benefits the whole polar world. Outside of Apex, the SCAR has many active agreements with lots of international organizations that work in the polar regions, including the organization that I represent, the European Polar Board. One of the fellowships actually is a really good example of the way that SCAR shared knowledge and best practice, because SCAR was one of the first organizations to set these fellowships up. And then with the success of the fellowships, a lot of organizations working in the polar regions understood the value of these fellowships. And now to date, we have COMNAP, IATO, and CAMLAR, and many other organizations that offer fellowship schemes that SCAR has definitely helped setting up in the beginning. SCAR is also quite active within has recently started being active in the equity, diversity, and inclusivity dialogue. So Adriana was speaking about the EDI action group that has been set up, of which she is the chair. We also share best practice within EDI with SUS and with the International Council of Science. SCAR and APB also have had a long-lasting and ongoing partnership. SCAR has always been there to support activities that the APB has carried out, and a couple of these major activities that have just recently taken place, really. One of them is SCAR was quite an active supporter of the Southern Ocean Initiative for the United Nations Decade, where APB was an active part of the task group that organized this activity. And we also collaborated quite heavily with SCAR for a recent UN Oceans Conference event, which was organized by the Prince Albert of Monaco Foundation. There's also support and capacity building activities at an organizational level that SCAR provides. A couple of examples of this are with the Polar Educators International, which I believe you will hear a talk right after mine from them. And we also have the Women in Polar Science, which has always been supported heavily by SCAR, and we are extremely thankful for that. So I'll just give you a quick introduction of what Women in Polar Science is. Our main goal is to build a strong global network of women researchers and, of course, also allies of various ages across disciplines and across geographies. Women in Polar Science really began when I was working for SCAR in 2014. And at the 2014 conference, we had a small meeting of like-minded individuals, and the co-founders that you see the pictures of there, we were surprised at how many people came at that very first meeting, which was an informally organized meeting. We had more than 50 people joining us, and I think that showed us the importance of setting up something, a network like this. We've had many volunteers over the years, and some of the names are present there, and I always thank all of the volunteers because we are here because of those volunteers, really. Today, we are a very strong network. We have more than 10,000 individuals that are participating in this through many different social media platforms. Like I said, we've always been supported by SCAR, and Women in Polar Science have held a lot of events at various SCAR conferences, starting from New Zealand. Then we had panel discussions in Malaysia, and we supported the Wikibomb activity that SCAR carried out. We also had an oversubscribed event at SCAR 2018 in Davos. We had a very successful workshop on inclusive collaborations in Antarctic research at SCAR 2020. And we also have a workshop in this conference. Please come and join us. It's on the 9th of August at 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock UTC. We have recently started a project called 100 Polar Women. The project director is Andrea Herbert. Unfortunately, she could not be here with us today, so I give you a couple of slides of introduction. This project is really to showcase the women that work in both the Arctic and Antarctic. And like Adriana was saying, it's very important for us to see these examples to understand that, you know, we have these amazing women that work in these harsh conditions, and see someone like ourselves reflected in these 100 polar women. Why? Because representation and visibility matter, because when young people are choosing their career, they want to see someone like themselves reflected in front of them so that they can identify and they can say, yes, this is for me. And that hopefully we are breaking that ice ceiling slowly with this project on 100 polar women. We are absolutely grateful for our support. This is the reason why I'm presenting this project here. The project is funded by the Edith and Munson Foundation and the Ocean Foundation in the US. And we are supported administratively by SCAR. We could not have done this project without SCAR. So thank you very much, SCAR, for this. If you go to our website, if you'd like to recommend someone in the 100 Polar Women, if you'd like to nominate someone, please go to the 100 Polar Women part of the Women in Polar Science website, and do contact us, please. We'd be happy to focus on your profile. So thank you very much. These are the links of some of the organizations that I spoke about, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you so much, Renuka. That's been really inspiring, basically, about the way that SCAR can play a role and how we're doing that right now. One of the organizations that was mentioned and that we mentioned earlier that we do work with is Polar Educators International. Polar Educators are a completely voluntary organization made up of people committed to educating at all levels. So from kindergarten right through to professional level researchers about the polar regions, trying to pass on their enthusiasm to the next generation and to everybody who's interested right now. So we've worked with them on various projects over the last few years. One of those projects, the Polar Resource Book, is a legacy of the IPY. And this is really a project that brings together many partners, not just Polar Educators and SCAR, but also IASC, our sister organization in the Arctic, APEX, and European Polar Board. So it's a great collaboration, and Polar Educators have sent us a couple of pre-recordings, one of which introduces them as an organization, and the second of which is specific about the Polar Resource Book. So I'll ask, yes, that the PEI intro video be played now, please.
Earth's polar regions are remote, beautiful, and challenging places, and they have a profound influence on every one of us around the world. With huge amounts of ice and snow, together with massive amounts of water moving to and from the polar oceans, they contribute dramatically to the weather and climate systems of our planet, which in turn drive the health of our global environment. The polar regions affect our behaviour, and we in turn affect theirs. The Earth is warming, and the Arctic and Antarctic are presently changing faster than any other regions of the Earth. Human activity is now playing a significant role in increasing Earth's surface temperature in ways that cannot be balanced out by natural processes. Change in the polar regions affects ecosystems and communities and the economies that depend on them, with local and global implications. Polar Educators International is an essential global network, working to amplify the voices of educators and researchers passionate about the polar regions and dedicated to understanding and communicating knowledge of the Arctic and the Antarctic. Working together, polar educators grow and strengthen our network, build resources and relationships, and develop polar research for a global audience. As the network grows, we communicate with wider audiences to continue to develop knowledge and appreciation of the polar regions, their connectedness to all Earth systems, and their importance to humans across latitudes and cultures. Join us.
Thank you very much for that. And now we can follow with the specific presentation on the Polar Resource Book project.
Hello and welcome to our presentation of Polar Educators International Polar Resource Book Update. Next, please. We are a network of polar educators, and the Polar Resource Book, as we call it, has actually got a much longer title, which is Polar Science and Global Climate, an international resource for education and outreach. It was published in 2010, and it was financed by the International Polar Year. During this talk, we'll talk about the downloads that we've done since we have this book downloaded on the PEI website. We'll talk about the cross-cutting project between ASSW, which is the Arctic Science Summit Week of 22, which was in March was held in Tromsø. The joint working groups with Apex, and a fundraising stage for the updated version of this book. Next, we present you the people with me. It's Betsy Wilkenin from Arizona, past president, and Sophie Weeks, who's the vice president, and myself, Maria Pia Casarini, for this year, president of PEI. Betsy will tell you more about the Polar Resource Book and the downloads.
So one of the first steps we had in moving forward with updating this resource was making it available for people to access instead of the hard copy that was available in the past. And with lots of work in the background, we finally were able to put it up onto the PEI website. And it's been up there since March 2021. And to date, we have had 355 downloads of the resource from 44 different countries. And it's out there on our website, polareducator.org, under featured resources. When people download the resource, they identify in a form what type of user they are. And so we had a variety, we allowed people to choose more than one. And you can see in this chart here that there is a large amount of researchers, 181 people self-identified, and a lot of them went and identified as a second kind of user too. And most of those are educator non-formal or science communicator. We also had people just self-identify as educator in general, and then added other things as to what they did, as such as provide professional development as a trainer. The other question we asked them when they went to the download was, what are your reasons for downloading the Polar Resource Book? And we've got a large amount of people that were using it as their own personal learning resource. Many were using it as a teaching tool in a classroom or other learning environment. and then a tool for communicating science and facilitating professional development were also very popular reasons.
Hi, I'm Sophie. So we're here to tell you whereabouts we're up to with the project, and we're very much at the fundraising stage. So we call it stage 3. And we were thinking what more during this stage we could do to help share and shape the process by which we might collaboratively update the education and outreach content and the science content in the Polar Resource Book. And in the spirit of IPY, we thought of doing some direct work with educators and polar researchers, looking at what kind of resources we might be able to create. So we're going to continue collecting the data that Betsy just showed you. We're going to continue nurturing new partnerships, but we also are trying to create some case studies. Next slide, please. So IASC, the International Arctic Science Council, funded us to do some of this work. There were three strands to this work. One, we thought we would try and work with the IASC working groups, whose science areas very much coincide with the science topics in the existing Polar Resource Book, and begin to update the Arctic science. Then we thought we would look at how we might work collaboratively with fellows, IASC fellows, SCAR fellows, and early career polar researchers, and get them working with educators to help co-develop resources. And then we've thought ahead to what kind of format the new publication might be, and obviously it being online is a possibility. We call it the EPRB. So we thought we might look at what kind of formats are possible. So the first strand was working with the IASC working groups, and that had its ups and its downs. So we have a bit more persuading to do to get people who are part of the working groups to help update the existing science in the book. The second strand of work we did was to go along to the Arctic Science Summit Week, and we took a team. Next slide, please. We took a team with us of polar early career researchers, Alona there, who was our Indigenous voice, and educators too, Inga Beck, and who's an advocate of the third pole. Many of you know her, and Ram here. And we ran some collaborative workshops with the IASC fellows and early career scientists who were at Arctic Science Summit Week. Next slide, please. So in this slide, you can see a lot of confused faces. I think everyone was wondering why on earth they're there, but there's Ram generating a bit of magic polar educators energy to get people talking. Next slide, please. Thank you. And as you can see, if you bring people together and you sprinkle the right kind of magic, they begin to talk about what they do. They like talking about what they do. But if you put some educators in the mix and an Indigenous voice or two in the mix as well, they begin to talk about what they do in a different way and think about how to communicate it. Next slide, please. And it just shows that if you bring the right people together in the right way, new things can be created. And it was a very energetic workshop. Conversations went on into the tea break. New collaborative resources were thought about and begun. Next slide, please. And the outcome from doing that in-person workshop is hopefully a joint working group with APEX and PEI, where educators and polar early career scientists can begin to work together on finding ways to communicate their science. And the third strand of the project would be working with an editor and the web designer to think what those resources might look like and how we might stage them on a website. Next slide, please. Over to Pia.
Thank you. Just to clarify, this project of updating the original Polar Resource Book has partners, and as you can see here, PEI is partnering with APEX, with IASC, and with SCAR. And of course, we are open to more partners if they are interested in collaborating towards this very worthwhile project. Next, please. And the fundraising, we over to Betsy because she is the one that started the next steps.
So we were finding when we wanted to go out for different funding that especially in the United States, we only existed as a network and we weren't officially anywhere on the books. And that's why we went ahead and we're in the process of creating PEI USA and getting our nonprofit status within the United States. What we plan on doing is becoming the funding arm for Polar Educators International. And this ability, once we become a nonprofit, will give us the mechanism for soliciting and receiving funding from various outside sources. And that one of them Pia is going to talk about right now.
Yes, and this has been a very welcome beginning of actual funding. This GLC Charitable Trust, the trustee came up while I was giving a lecture. I just gave a lecture talking about this updating the version of the Polar Resource Book. I was in Parma in Italy, and he's now pledged $20,000. Next, please. Next slide. He's also interested in sponsoring health and art and education. And so he's pledged $10,000 in 2022 and $10,000 the following year for this publication. It's an encouraging start, and we hope that having about 1/5 of the money necessary to achieve our aim, that other partners and other people can give us ideas on where to fundraise and join us about it. I like to say that I'm the person responsible for coordinating all the partners for this project. And you can see this is part of the book, a chapter that you can download. If you go to polareducator.org, as Betsy said, featured resources, we call it PRB2, but it is actually an update. And if you want to get in touch with us, you can always send us an email to polareducator@gmail.com.
Okay. Hopefully we didn't lose anything off the end of that video, but it was great to hear about the progress and potentially even further progress from Polar Educators on that project. And of course, we'll continue to work closely with them on that to progress what is a really important educational resource. We're very lucky to have working within the Secretariat at present, Dr. Inge Beck, who's really has experience of polar education right back to the IPY, has worked extensively with Polar Educators and APEX, and she's been working with SCAR on a particular educational initiative that makes use of our social media channels. I'd like to introduce Inge to talk about that subject now. Sorry, Inge, you're muted.
Yes, hello everybody. Thanks for the introduction. Can you see my screen? Yes, perfect. So I have just some slides about the initiative I just mentioned before. It's about sharing or profit from each other, two organizations that are doing or working within the field of education. So I called it now the SCAR CBET and PEI Education Initiative. And I'm forward. So SCAR has the CBET committee, which Eoghan already mentioned before, which is the committee about capacity building, education and training. And of course, Polar Educators is also doing a lot of educational work in terms of polar education and environmental education. So we thought one day, why not profit from each other? And because both of them are doing education, of course, and there's a lot of material in the web and lots of activities going on. But we realized that many people don't really know where they are. And we also realized that many activities are not really shared. So many people, many teachers do an amazing work within their within their universities, within their schools and kindergarten. But well, they just are not promoting it, and then nobody really knows about it, which is kind of sad because it could also motivate others to go into schools and do things like that. So our idea was just to use or just to get to get active and to bring more attention to those wonderful material and to those wonderful activities, and to distribute it much better than it was done before. And so we started a joint social media campaign this year in January. And so far we have like once a month a post about either material or an education activity, or also upcoming events that we are posting both and then sharing both. And then we already saw that this has a wide distribution, and yeah, so we hope that by doing this, we will get much more or much better and broader audience, and more people knowing about what's going on there in polar education. And saying that, of course, you are also very welcome if you do something like that, or you have something like that, to send us the material, to send us your activity, what you have done, or also just if you heard of something, it's also very welcome. It's not restricted or limited to one post a month. If we get more, we can do more. It was just a start. And of course, you are also welcome to share what you see. And that's all noticed with the hashtag ScarCBET or #PEI. And so if you have something, just send an email to inga@scar.org, and we will surely get back to you and bring it at one time on social media. Yeah, that was already my little talk. Thanks for listening and not falling asleep. And then I think we're gonna have questions at the end, or right now, because it took not much time.
Okay. Yes. Thank you so much, Inga. It's been great to see the initiative get the traction that it has, and we hope certainly to continue that. As Inga was saying, yes, we'll have a full Q&A session at the end, and we'll discuss anything you want to add in there across all of the topics. I just want to share my screen again, just to mention number one, the closing date for the visiting scholarships. It's open at present. The closing date is the 28th of September 2022. I don't think I mentioned that before, and I think the slide actually referred to 2020, so that's been quickly changed. Again, across all of these, after this session, if you have questions, follow up with info@SCAR or any of the other contact details on the SCAR website. We did mention briefly the medals in several of these conversations, and the medals has been one of those areas where we've been able to take advice both from the SCAR CBET committee and from the EDI action group to try and improve the process to actually reflect what we want from the SCAR medals. We understand that peer recognition is a way of rewarding and highlighting those who exemplify the best of the Antarctic community. And so each of the medals is meant to reflect that. Now, practically how we implement it, of course, has a real impact on how effectively the medals process is actually reflecting that ambition. So For 2022, a new nomination process was introduced. As Adriana said, it was a two-stage process. So that meant that it was a much simpler initial nomination, one-pager basically. And from that, the reviewers selected shortlists for each of the medals. Some further information was then solicited from the nominators, and then it was passed on for final review. This has resulted in a notable increase in new nominations for the medals. It's also noticeably improved the gender balance. Clearly, this is the first iteration. We'll hopefully be able to make further progress on this, and we'll review it as we go through the next year in preparation for the next round, which will be in 2024. I'll also note that yesterday we announced the 2022 medal recipients, and as part of the closing ceremony on Friday, we will be delivering the citations and responses from the medal awardees. So I'd encourage everybody to tune in for that. Some inspiring individuals receiving the award, of course, this year. With that, I will stop sharing my screen. And yes, I think we have plenty of time to be able to field any questions you want to fire into the Q&A. The first question in there, I think, is more one that we can tackle as a panel. And so I would suggest that as we discuss that, if you have any further questions across any of the topics we've talked about, please send them into the Q&A and we'll deal with them as well. So the first question is from an anonymous attendee. SCAR and the SCAR Secretariat is fantastic at ensuring inclusion and diversity. The opening by the local organisers was unfortunately not diverse at all and featured 8 men. So I would put it to the panel, what can we do better in the context of that?
Okay, as I mentioned in my little talk, I wish we could have this button, right, to make imbalances instantly disappear and then everything will work fine. But this is a work in progress. We are still, we are just gathered the people to work in these work streams I just mentioned. And of course, we are going to make recommendations to SCAR regarding gender balance, geographical balance, and trying to equilibrate this kind of issues. But you cannot expect an instant sort of result. This is how the community has to work together to make this happen. This is not, this is a long task, long trend task we have to achieve. And we have to make conscious of this, because I'm pretty sure that the organizing committee was not really aware of this imbalance. Once you put it on the spot, people see it, but otherwise they think, okay, so we put our important people to show this. And there's also the crystal ceiling problem and a lot of stuff we have to tackle, but this is not an instant way of tackle these problems. We have to work on that and make people aware, and then we will start to find results.
Okay, thank you. Renuka, did you want to talk to that?
Yeah, just a quick couple of sentences. I think we need to acknowledge that a few balls were dropped, that some things fell between the gaps, unfortunately, and that we will strive to do better from the EDI action group for sure. SCAR, as far as I remember, does prepare a little handbook for the local organizing committee for the future conferences. And if that is still continuing, then I think we've already talked within the EDI action group that we will have a set of recommendations that will go into that handbook for the next conference onwards. So I think a clear acknowledgement that there was a mistake, and we will do better next time.
Okay, thanks, Renuka. Yeah, clearly, from the SCAR's perspective, we have a role in terms of, as you say, guiding hosts. I'm not sure, you know, clearly that has evolved over the years, but we plan these meetings so far in advance, we're not necessarily sure which, you know, guidance that individual hosts would have been working to. And of course, it's kind of passive from, you know, the SCAR perspective as well, that we have the guidance out there. We also need to be involved so that we can actually, you know, make sure that that ambition is actually being delivered on when we put together events. So clearly, if there are things that's, you know, as SCAR Central, if you like, that we need to be doing better, then that's really where we're looking for the advice from the EDI Action Group and the CBET committee as well, where it's relevant. So yeah, I think plenty more to do there. Anybody else want to speak to that, or shall we move on? Morgan,
I'll say something, yeah, briefly, if that's all right. To build on what Adriana and Renuka have said, I think it's important that the issue was raised and, you know, continually throughout this conference, because different groups of people will have different insights into how we might do better in the future. And no doubt there will be conversations happening between the Secretariat and XCOM and the local organizers and the EDI Action Group about how to improve this in the future. But also wanted to let everybody who's listening know that if you are interested in these issues, the EDI Action Group membership is open to everybody in the community. So please do consider joining. Maybe we can share the link in the chat, and you can share your concerns, thoughts, and ideas. And as the leadership cycles rotate, feel free to join at the leadership level when that becomes available as well. So we do always welcome as wide and diverse an input as possible into how we build solutions around these issues.
Thanks. Yeah, that's really powerful. And I believe, Renuka, you want to share a slide? Okay.
Yeah, so I think just going into the whole talk about diversity, we are talking about gender diversity to begin with for the Open Science Conference opening ceremony issue, but in general as well. I think diversity means, for the first thing is diversity means some very different things to people around the world. Diversity is kind of earmarked according to some of our identities that we hold, but we hold so many different identities as individuals, and these identities tend to change over time and also with context to where we are at any given moment. Some of the examples of these kind of labels that we hold, I've put up on the slide. So gender is just one of those. There are many other identities that we have, and these identities can interact with each other, synergize with each other, or make things more difficult if a few of these labels come and interact negatively. This is something called intersectionality. Morgan is our resident scholar on intersectionality, so I won't say too much more, but we do have talks about intersectionality as well within the conference, as well as within the workshop that I had said we will be talking about these different identities and what they mean for the diversity dialogue in general. So while we start off talking about gender diversity, I think we should also keep in mind that there's so many other aspects of inclusivity that we should not lose sight of. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. That's very helpful. Okay, I'd like to move on to the next question in the box, which is there's a message for Inga saying the social media might be restrictive both in terms of age, culture, and geography. I think we're clearly trying to work across as many modes of delivery as possible, if you like, from the website through social media as well. I think it's simply that social media gives you opportunities that you don't get through other media. And so we'd like to try and make creative use of them. But of course, you know, if there are other ways to host and make these things available, then, you know, we'll investigate that as well. Inga, I don't know if you want to speak to that. Okay, maybe not.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I just have to put it off. I think that of course there are much more possibilities, and of course it is restricted to a certain age and a certain group of persons. This is only one initiative that we took so far, and I mean it using conferences like, well, in real conferences is another possibility. And of course, what I think is also very important, just use like local newsletters and so on, or papers. But as I said, this is only one little initiative, and everything else and every idea is very welcome to use more.
Great, thanks. And yeah, as I mentioned, these are available through the education resource webpage on the SCAR website. So they are available not just on social media, if you like. Okay. There's a question from Alice Oates. Beyond the recently created Access and Polar Research Group, are the panelists aware of anyone working on disability inclusion in Antarctic research? There's already been a typed answer, very helpful one from Alex Thornton. Do anybody on the panel have any other insights into particular initiatives?
We are in contact with different polar researchers groups, and this is one of them. So, yes.
Great. Okay.
I think just a short comment. I think there are some initiatives at the national level that are taking place, and I think COMNAP has good oversight of those. Hopefully, we'll get COMNAP to do a short presentation in our workshop next week, and we should have some more knowledge of these.
Great. Morgan?
I'm not sure if Alice Oates would want me to say this, but I would have actually sent a WhatsApp message to Alice Oates to ask her that question. I think she's a great resource on this. And just to say from a social science humanities perspective, that there has been a lot of, and is an increasing amount of research on a number of aspects of EDI in Antarctic research, Antarctic history, the communities today around gender, race, class. There is not a lot around disability. I can't think of anything offhand focused on disability. So this is an area that we're thinking about capacity building. I think there is a real gap waiting to be filled as far as what resources can be devoted towards disability as an issue in the community today, and in our understanding of the issues that keep certain members of our community from being able to participate equally and thrive in the community. And I think we can also perhaps look to the space science and exploration community for some examples. This is why I thought of Alice Oates. She's been doing some work on this, and there are always opportunities for Antarctic research to work with related fields and in cognate spaces to see what's been working well in similar endeavors. So encourage our community and think about how I and our EDI action group community can highlight those resources and apply them to the Antarctic community as well.
Great. I'm not wishing to continually go back to you, Morgan, but there is another question, which is, do we have data on how many selected candidates from developing programs have gone on fellowships to developed program nations? And Morgan did some amazing work for us earlier in the year that's fed into the work of the EDI Action Group, looking specifically at this issue across where fellowships are applying from, where they're going to, all of those sorts of things. So either Morgan or Adriana, did you want to?
Sure, I could say something very briefly, which is just that there is some data available around this. It all depends on how you splice the data. So I had a certain amount of time to work with SCAR on this. And I did look at different factors around nationality. I think that if I remember correctly, the data that I was using was focused on country income level. So it may not be, the same categories that the person who posed the question has in mind, but there is data certainly related to that question. And I'll let Adriana speak to what the group intends to do with the data.
Yes, after the Open Science Conference, we're going to start to look at the data and prepare white papers of the community with benefit of the findings. So stay tuned, like Eoghan had mentioned, more work to do.
That's great. Yeah, and of course, part of the importance of the EDI group is to be able to look at across all of the programs, basically to have a sense of how SCAR is doing in terms of diversity. But we have to be careful of respecting people's information. And so there is a process to go through to pull out all of the data we can on an anonymous basis from all of the schemes and meetings that we go to be able to feed into the EDI group so that they have up-to-date and comprehensive information to work from. And one of the things we do need to do is to build that into all of the meetings we do going forward, making it easy for conveners and for people who are pulling together meetings, at a smaller level than the Open Science Conference, to be able to get that data, to be confident that it can be used in a confidential way appropriately, and to get a little bit more depth in what we do. We have periodically reviewed how the fellowships have been doing in terms of geographic destinations and that sort of thing, but having the EDI group in place to look at that method, on a regular basis, and to be bring the appropriate methodologies to it, I think is really important. I do know I've been told to be louder in the chat, but nobody's ever complained about that from me before, so I seem to be being understood reasonably well. So that, I think, takes us to the end of the questions. And at this point, I will ask the panelists if they have any particular topics they would like to discuss at this point, or anything from the first few days of the conference, other than the opening ceremony, that they think we need to particularly talk about. Of course, all of the upcoming sessions on inclusivity, we all encourage everybody to take part in as much as possible. And I did mention that the closing ceremony will be particularly good from the point of view of recognizing those individuals who've been awarded for their service to the community over the years. But if we don't have any other topics, I'd just like to end by saying that, having the EDI group and making sure that everybody feels they're included in what SCAR does isn't just an ambition, it's actually a practicality for SCAR. As a volunteer organization, we simply can't operate. We couldn't operate any of our fellowship schemes. Certainly our groups wouldn't be able to operate unless everybody feels they have a home within SCAR. So this is crucial work that we need to continue, and we need to make sure that it's been done in the appropriate way. So we'll continue to support these groups. We'll continue to try and improve our capacity building activities, and we welcome feedback on any of those at any time, as I've mentioned. But as we have no other questions right now, and if we don't have anything else, I'm sure the panel are probably already getting a little bit of fatigue from their input to the meeting so far. We want to keep them going till the end. So with that, I will close the session and thank everybody for their contributions.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Eoghan, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to shut down the session now. Bye.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
Thanks, Eoghan.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you all.